From referee Yves Lavigne being on the commission that legalized the sport and held the first ever commission-sanctioned MMA event in North America, to all the elite competitors from UFC 3 to today that came from the country and won the world championships, I believe it's fair to say that Canada has played a key role in the history of mixed martial arts. Today, we take a look at the 10 best Canadian MMA fighters of all time. There has been almost 100 Canadian fighters who competed at least once for the UFC, and that's not even looking at all the guys who competed for Pride, Strikeforce, Bellator, or even for UCC when it was one of the biggest promotions in the world in the early 2000s. So picking only 10 fighters was almost an impossible task. I ranked them according to their records, their number of fights in major promotion, their best wins and losses, their title wins, defenses and challenges, and other accomplishments like winning a tournament or being undefeated outside of major promotions. I also asked for some help from Ken Wong from La Voix des Guerriers and from the guys at MMA Empire, so a big thank you to them for their insight. Also, a big shout out to Taylor Simmons, who edits the list of Canadian UFC fighters on Wikipedia, which has been a much needed tool for this video. Before we get started with the top 10, I have 6 honorable mentions. Gary Goodridge, Alexis Davis, Joe Doerksen, John Alessio, Denis Kang, and the Lionheart Steve Vigneault. Let's begin the top 10, and at number 10 we've got John Makdessi. Unlike many fighters on this list, Makdessi has not won nor even competed for a major title in his career yet. But the man has made his UFC debut in December of 2010, and close to 11 years later he's still competing and winning in the deepest and most talented division in the UFC. In his 18 UFC fights, the 4th most in history for a Canadian fighter, Makdessi has defeated the likes of Sam Stout, Ross Pearson, Darren Cruikshank, and Shane Campbell, while only losing to established names like Cowboy Cerrone, Yancy Medeiros, and Francisco Trinaldo, to name a few. He spent only 2 years of his pro career outside of the UFC, and he never lost a fight outside of the world's biggest promotion. For all these reasons, John Makdessi is the 10th best Canadian MMA fighter of all time. At number 9, we've got Sam Stout. After starting his pro MMA career with a loss and a draw, Hands of Stone went on an 8-fight winning streak with 6 knockouts, winning the TKO lightweight title and defending it 4 times in the process. He then signed with the UFC, where he defeated Spencer Fisher in the first of his 20 UFC bouts, the 3rd most of all time for a Canadian fighter. He first went back and forth between the UFC and TKO before making the full jump with the Vegas-based promotion in 2008 until he retired in 2015. During his UFC run, Stout won 7 UFC performance bonuses, 6 of those being Fight of the Night awards. He's tied for the most UFC bonuses of all time amongst Canadian fighters, and he's widely recognized as one of the most exciting action fighters of his generation. That's why Sam Stout is the 9th best Canadian MMA fighter of all time. At number 8, it's Carlos Newton. This MMA pioneer became the first ever Canadian UFC champion when he defeated Pat Miletich at UFC 31 to claim the welterweight title. He was also one of the only fighters that was allowed to compete for the UFC and the Pride at the same time in the early 2000s. He's the Canadian fighter who fought the most often for a UFC title, only behind GSP, as he was a UFC 70 tournament finalist and fought 3 other times for the UFC welterweight title. While he does not have the best record on the list, the submission master fought every MMA legend near his weight class and almost only lost to guys that were not named Matthews and that were way bigger than him, like Anderson Silva, Dan Anderson, and Kazushi Sakuraba. For all these accomplishments and being a pioneer for the sport, Carlos Newton is the 8th best Canadian MMA fighter of all time. At number 7, it's TJ Grant. This is probably one of the saddest what-if stories in Canadian MMA history. TJ Grant entered the UFC in 2009 and went 3-3 as a welterweight, losing to eventual champ Johnny Hendricks and ranked fighter Dong Yun Kim. He then made the jump to lightweight in 2011, where he established himself as one of the best lightweights in the world with 4 straight wins. That's when he collected the best but also the last win of his MMA career against Great Maynard. At that point, there were no doubts that TJ Grant was the #1 contender in the best weight class of the UFC. He was then booked to fight UFC lightweight champion Benson Henderson on August 31st, 2013, but he suffered a concussion in training and had to pull out. He was replaced by Anthony Pettis, who won the title, and they were targeted to fight in December of 2013, but Grant was still suffering from the symptoms of the concussion and he was not medically cleared to compete. As his injury problems lingered, Grant was forced to get a job. He also became a father around that time and he had to provide for his family. With the pay being so low, he deemed that fighting again would put his body at risk and his family in debt, so he walked away silently without ever officially retiring. We will never know if TJ Grant would have become the 3rd Canadian UFC champion, but we surely know that he left us with a legacy that makes him the 7th best Canadian MMA fighter of all time. At number 6, it's Sarah Kaufman. One name that is often wrongfully passed over when looking at the best fighters in Canada's history. Sarah Kaufman is an MMA pioneer in her own rights. She was crowned the first ever Strikeforce Women's Bantamweight Champion in 2009 at a time where the best women's MMA talent in the world competed for Strikeforce. So even though she never got to wear the UFC title, she was at once the #1 women's bantamweight fighter in the world. Along the years, she has defeated some of the greatest fighters of her generation like Miesha Tate, Alexis Davis, Liz Carmouche, and Roxanne Modafferi. Her losses look really good too, as she was only defeated by legends like Ronda Rousey, Valentina Shevchenko, Marlo Skoonen, Alexis Davis, and a 155-pound fighter in the PFL. For her importance in the history of women's MMA and being the first ever Strikeforce Women's Bantamweight Champion, Sarah Kaufman is the 6th best Canadian MMA fighter of all time. Let's move on with the top 5, and at number 5, we've got David Loiseau. One of the true Canadian MMA OGs, Loiseau was a staple for UCC in the early 2000s, back when it was one of the biggest promotions in the world. He made his UFC debut in 2003 before coming back to TKO for a couple of fights and then returning to the UFC, where he won 3 in a row and defeated former champion Evan Tanner to earn a shot at the title. Loiseau then headlined the UFC 58 USA vs Canada card in a middleweight championship fight against Rich Franklin, which he lost by decision. Loiseau would fight 3 more times for the UFC before the end of his career in 2014, also competing for Elite XC, World Series of Fighting, and Taichi Palace Fighting, where he won the middleweight title. He was also crowned ECC light heavyweight champion in one of his last fights in 2013. For all these accomplishments and for paving the way for the newer generations of MMA athletes, The Crow is the 5th best Canadian MMA fighter of all time. At number 4, it's the Predator, Patrick Côté. One of the most beloved action fighters in MMA history, Côté was never involved in a boring fight. While he was far from being the greatest pure athlete in the sport, his technical proficiency and his unparalleled art turned him into one of the most legendary Canadian fighters ever. He slowly built one of the most impressive resumes on the list. He fought for the UFC 21 times, the 2nd most of all time for Canadian fighters, and he never lost a fight outside of the promotion. He challenged for the UFC middleweight title, was a finalist in the 4th season of The Ultimate Fighter, and always found his way back to the UFC despite being let go multiple times. He ended his career in 2017 with 10 straight UFC bouts. He also fought some of the greatest fighters of multiple generations, facing guys like Tito Ortiz, Anderson Silva, Cowboy Cerrone, and Wonderboy Thompson. With such a resume, I'm very comfortable saying that Patrick Côté is the 4th best Canadian MMA fighter of all time. It's now time for the top 3, and at number 3, it's Mark Hominick. One of the most recognized fighters of his generation, Mark Hominick spent nearly 90% of his pro career fighting for a major organization, whether it was the UFC, WEC, Affliction, or TKO UCC. He was also able to reach the highest level in all of these promotions, winning the UCC TKO championships twice and defending it a total of 7 times. He didn't have time to fight for the WEC featherweight title because it merged with the UFC, but he came into the promotion as a top top contender and instantly won a title eliminator. He was then involved in the first ever UFC featherweight title fight when he challenged Jose Aldo in front of 55,000 fans at the Rogers Center in Toronto. Along the way, Hominick defeated the likes of Yves Edwards, Brian Caraway, Leonard Garcia, and George Roop while maintaining a 80% finishing rate. I think it's safe to say that Mark Hominick is Canadian MMA royalty, and that's why I've got him as the third best Canadian MMA fighter of all time. At number 2, we've got Rory MacDonald. When Rory made his way to the UFC with a 9-0 record in 2010, he was set to be the next great Canadian star, and it's fair to say that he did just that. MacDonald pretty much accomplished everything there is to accomplish in MMA outside of winning the UFC title. We have to say that he had a way longer road to the title than usual, as his mentor and training partner GSP was the champion in his division for a long time. But as soon as GSP left, Rory was able to challenge for the belt. He fell short of winning the title, but gave us what is widely considered as the best MMA fight of all time against Robbie Lawler at UFC 189. He then became the highest profile MMA free agent of all time after finishing his UFC deals and testing the waters, and he was able to secure a very lucrative deal with Bellator MMA. He went on to become the Bellator welterweight champion. He then moved up unsuccessfully for a champion versus champion fight with the Bellator middleweight champion Gegard Mousasi before entering the Bellator welterweight Grand Prix, where he defended his title 2 times and made it to the final, where he ultimately lost to Douglas Lima. Rory is still active and trying to make history as a contestant in the 2021 season of the PFL. The list of household names that MacDonald defeated in his pro MMA career is astonishing, as he beat Tyron Woodley, BJ Penn, Nate Diaz, Jake Ellenberger, Damian Maia, Douglas Lima, Paul Daly, Jordan Mean, and that's just to name a few. He greatly separates himself from the rest of the list with all these accomplishments, and that's why he currently is the second best Canadian MMA fighter of all time. And finally, at number 1, is gonna be a huge surprise when I tell you that is Georges St-Pierre. I could speak about GSP's accolade for hours, but everyone here knows why he's the number 1. He basically is the consensus greatest MMA fighter of all time. He's a 3-time UFC champion, one of the few 2-division champions in the history of the UFC. He holds the record for most UFC welterweight title defenses, along with a slew of other promotional records, and he is also a UFC Hall of Famer. He avenged his only 2 losses in career, fought and defeated 2 to 3 generations of the greatest welterweights, and he is the main reason why MMA is as popular as it is in Canada. Basically, Georges is the greatest fighter of all time and one of the most influential and important figures in the history of the sport, and by default, he is the best Canadian MMA fighter of all time. That concludes my list of the 10 best Canadian MMA fighters of all time. Leave a like on the video if you enjoyed, and comment to tell me if I forgot somebody, if my ranking is good, if it's wrong, anything you want to say it in the comments and I will look at it for sure. Also, make sure to subscribe to MMA Talk on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for more content like this, and to stay tuned on every news in the world of Canadian MMA. Thanks for watching and see you next time.